I'd like to ask Brad to come and share whatever it is the Lord would want you to share with us today at this time. Thanks, Brad.
I haven't got used to this yet, so I'm not sure how to maneuver with it. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's really neat to see new faces every time we get to come here. I just had the privilege of running back home to Dallas, Texas for about 8 days and was surrounded there with aunts and uncles and cousins and siblings and my poor bachelor brother who lives alone and has for years and therefore has everything in his house exactly like he wants it. Had 20 of us sleeping there for a week. And it was a miracle of grace how well he handled the trauma. It's always fun for me to have our extended family together like that because we have an apparently infinite capacity to hear the same stories over and over. My younger sister has a new boyfriend, and she brought him to the house on 2 different occasions. And on the second occasion afterwards, he said, "Your family really repeats themselves, don't they?" They were telling the same stories last time. And she had to explain, well, there was a different crowd, more relatives had come. My brother, I think, as we got together and retold the same old stories and the same old jokes, they're always funny to us. I think my brother, younger brother, is the greatest storyteller, one of the greatest storytellers I know. And you don't often see him anymore. He lived a prodigal son kind of life when he was younger, and a lot of what I knew of his personality when he was a kid you don't see as much now. But this day, as all the cousins are together with him and he starts getting kind of pumped up, he returned to an old form I hadn't seen in a long time. He's telling stories with that animation that I've described to Karen but that she's never seen. And starts telling this story about Daddy spanking him, a belt, which is not typically good material to make a funny story out of. But that's what great storytellers do. And he had 20 people in their 40s on up, just in hysterics, gasping to breathe. They were laughing so hard. And him telling this story and flailing around with his gestures as he tells them. And so I love stories, and I wish I was that kind of storyteller. But it's a rare and dying art form. Now they have contests and fairs where they try to attract master storytellers to keep that art alive. But before the internet and before TV, before radio, before the best international best-selling author, there was the storyteller. And he was the person that filled all those roles then. He was the one that kept the old memories and the family lore and the tribal lore alive and fresh in people's minds. And I think that Jesus was the greatest storyteller who ever lived, and he lived in an age of great storytellers. Jesus' stories that are recorded in the Bible are called parables, and a lot of times it's not the mere facts of the story that make them worth repeating for 2,000 years. It's the great storyteller's ability to find something incredible in the middle of that story that we relate to. And there's one story he told, the story of the prodigal son, is usually how it's titled. But in that story, the story of the prodigal son, it has been called the greatest story ever told, the greatest short story ever told. And it has the almost unique ability to stick with you when you've heard it. And as you go over that story and recall it in your mind, if you allow it to enter into your heart, at some point you identify with every one of the main characters. And that's kind of unusual. You go to a movie or watch a show on TV, read a book, and there's one person you're obviously supposed to identify with. But in this story, you tend to identify with all of them sooner or later. The story begins, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, "Father, I want right now what's coming to me." So the father divided the property between them. This story is in Luke 15, 11 through 32. You won't be able to follow along without paying real close attention, because as I was studying, preparing, I looked through several translations, and there'd be a verse where I'd say, "Oh, that's perfect. I love the way he said that." I don't know Greek, so as far as I know, all of the good, reliable translations are legitimate. And so if I see one that really draws out the particular flavor of that idea, and then I go look at my little dictionaries, is that really what he's saying there? Yeah, that's really what he's saying there. So I've kind of copied and pasted the story together. He says, a certain man had 2 sons. The younger said to his father, "Father, I want right now what's coming to me." So the father divided the property between them. In those days, the main source of wealth was land. It was where all wealth came from, whether you're producing crops or you've got vineyards or fig trees or olive trees or whatever. The land is what produces the wealth. And what the son's basically asking is for the father to sell his half of the land. He expects there's 2 sons, so he should get half, and that might usually be the way we go. At least he gets a major share. And when the father dies, that would be his inheritance. He's basically telling the father, "Drop dead now, because I want the money. I want to sell the land and convert it to cash, and I'm basically tired of growing grapes or cattle or whatever they're growing." But a family's land meant more than just what it produced for the family. Land was vital to the maintenance of the existence of the tribe, the clan, the extended family. When my family got together to see me this past week, they came from Little Rock, Dallas, Phoenix. I came from Australia. We don't live like that anymore. But in those days, the whole nation of Israel was a set of boundaries, and they're divided up between tribes, and the tribe's land is further subdivided down to the individual family. And so it's vitally important to them to keep the land and to keep those borders intact. It's a rough and savage time to live. And if you don't have a tribe of which you're a part, you don't last very long. You don't just roam the world alone and stay alive. You have to have the clan to maintain your identity and existence as a people. So it's vital to pass on your land to your own children, to keep in the family, the clan, the tribe. All worth and identity reside in the clan. So this son is telling his father to drop dead so he can have his inheritance now. But he's also, beyond insulting his father, he's insulting and rejecting the whole tribe. I don't need you, I don't want you, and I don't care what happens to the tribe. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and took a trip to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money on wild living, the story says. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him to feed his pigs. The one final thing that this guy can do to bring dishonor to himself and to his family and to his tribe, he has now done. His people found pigs to be a loathsome, disgusting, unclean animal. They not only would not raise them or eat them, they would not even touch them. And he's now lower than a pig farmer. He's a pig farmer's hired hand. He was so hungry, the story says, that he would have eaten the corn cobs and the pig slop, but no one would give him anything. But now here comes, in my estimation, the first positive twist in this story. We could pass right over this line without thinking anything about it, but I think in this passing phrase, the compliment of enormous power and hope is paid to this hungry, shame-filled young man. The story says, but when he came to himself. And this is one of those phrases that I said, okay, I like this translation more than that translation. It does mean that, but that is something extraordinary if we don't just take it as a cliche phrase to move to the next thought. When he came to himself, all these terrible decisions he's made, all the things he's done that have reduced him to shame and to hunger and left him alone and apparently unloved and unlovable, don't define him. That's not who he really is, and it's not what he's really worth. When he came to himself, he runs into himself, and he looks in a mirror, and he sees what his Father sees. And it's not the sum total of all the shame that he's brought on himself. When he came to himself, he remembered who he is and whose he is and where he came from. And the story says that he said to himself, how many of my Father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am, dying of hunger. Now, this moment, when he comes to himself, his world changes. In this moment, when he remembers that he has a Father of such love and such provision that the least important people back home have more than enough, he finds in that spark of hope, in the middle of his shame and pain, the courage to say, I will arise and go to my Father. And that's just one of the coolest sentences in the world. When we get to the place where we can say, I will arise and go to my Father. But still he expects he's going to have to grovel and beg. His father has every right, and the village will insist that he exercise the right to insist that he be banned from the village and never acknowledge any obligation by the clan to him again, because he has shamed them and himself. So he prepares a speech to give to his father in the hopes of at least becoming a higher class of hired hand back home than he is on the pig farm, since he knows he can never be called son again. So he says, I will arise and go to my Father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I don't deserve to be called your son. Take me on as a hired hand. So he got up and came to his father. I have to confess to you at some point in this message that, and this, I've never really quite felt this way before, but as soon as I finished preaching the last time, that Steve asked me to preach. I hoped that he would ask me again because I wanted to look at this story with you, because it gives us so much opportunity to remember who we are, to remember who God is, and it gives us such an opportunity to let God go still deeper in our hearts, because the beauty of infinite love and infinite grace is no matter how long we've walked with Him, and no matter how long we've served Him, we haven't reached infinity yet. And He can still take us further. And He wants to. And this is a terrific story for opening our hearts to see what does He have next for me. I love words. I have grown, as I've gone through the stages of cancer, I've grown increasingly tired. And it's been harder and harder to keep my thoughts focused. And I don't always write out a message as I'm preparing it word for word. Occasionally I do, and it's a bad thing to do because once I've written it out, I think, oh, that's as good as I can say that. And it's not usually the best method of delivery to read a message. But I've just had a hard time being able to focus well enough to be confident that I could stay on track. I love words. Sometimes to a fault, I love my own words. My wife's trying to fall asleep at night, and I won't stop. But I love other people's words. I grew up with my dad before I was old enough to read. My dad would read poetry to me. And if I liked a poem, like all kids do, I'd get him to read the same thing to me over and over and over until I had it memorized. The first time I ever did anything in exchange for pay was when a neighbor lady came over and asked me to recite a poem to her dinner guests that she'd heard me do at our house. And it would be terribly inappropriate to do it today, but at the time it was well received. And I've been reading, Roland and I've been reading Winston Churchill, and it's just amazing the way he puts words together. I just love what the English language can do, and I'm sure other languages as well, if I knew them, can do if they're put in the hands of a master. And I think that in the next two sentences in this story, Jesus has done something like that. I think these two sentences, which might seem merely nice, may be the most beautiful, powerful, eloquent, moving words in the English language. These words turn our world upside down. No, they turn our world right side up. These words turn a dark, scary, empty room into a surprise birthday party. They turn fear into stunned, astonished joy. They turn death row into pardon and freedom. They turn a criminal and an orphan into a child and an heir. The next two sentences in the story, in whatever translation I pulled them from, but they equally take first prize, no matter which translation you read them in, are these. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, and filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. While he was still a long way off, his father ran to him and hugged him and kissed him. Now this father knows that the townspeople, if they see the son and reaching first, will perform the ceremony of banishment against this son. And he has disgraced him, he has disgraced them, He's disgraced himself. On the entirely other end of the importance spectrum, they have a rule about modesty. The men wear robes that go down floor length. Most men have not had this opportunity, but most women probably have at some point in their lives, trying to walk up a flight of stairs in a full-length evening gown, or trying to run in something like that. And you're either going to trip over yourself and look not only immodest, but very ungraceful, or you're going to have to hike them up a little bit to survive that little exercise. And so they have a debate. They think it's immodest and shameful to show bare legs. And they have a debate about whether it's okay even to hike your robe up a little bit to keep your robe from being torn up by thorns when you're walking outside. But there's no way to run to the sun in a long robe and sandals without the father hiking up his robes to keep from tripping over it. So this father embarrasses himself without concern for what anyone thinks, and he hikes up his robe, exposing his bare calves, and races the town elders to the city gate to reach his son first, so he can embrace him before the town has a chance to condemn him. The son doesn't get the chance to walk all the way to the father. The father doesn't stand with crossed arms and contemptuous scowl, waiting for the son to grovel and beg before throwing him a bone or throwing him out. The story says while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. The son started his speech. He's still, in his mind, a slave. So the speech he's been rehearsing, the long walk home, he starts now. Father, I've sinned against God. I've sinned before you. I don't deserve to be called your son ever again. But the father wasn't listening. There have been a lot of times in my life as a father when my kids were talking and I wasn't listening. And I feel badly about that. It was a bad choice. I've done that a lot with Jacob. The least shameful and most entertaining version of that flaw in me was my daughter when she was probably 2 years old. And I'm sitting in my recliner reading a newspaper, or trying to, and she's just chattering away to me. And I'm doing my best to get this article in the newspaper read and ignore her. And first I've got the paper between her face and mine. And then she crawls up under the newspaper, so I'm reading the paper like this around her with her in front of me. She finally grabs both of my ears and puts her nose right up against mine and says, "Daddy, I'm talking to you." But this time, the father's right. He doesn't need to hear the son's speech. He doesn't let him finish. He was calling to the servants, "Quick, bring a clean set of clothes and dress him. Put the family ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Then get a grain-fed heifer and roast it. We're going to feast." We're going to feast. We're going to have a wonderful time. My son is here, given up for dead and now alive, given up for lost and now found. And they did begin to have a wonderful time. All this time, his older son was out in the field. When the day's work was done, he came in. As he approached the house, his older son's out in music, and when he approached the house, he heard the music and dancing. Calling over one of the houseboys, he asked what was going on, and the houseboy told him, "Your brother came home. Your father has ordered a feast, barbecued beef." because he has him home safe and sound. The older brother stalked off in an angry sulk and refused to join in. His father came and began to plead with him. Now, look at that for a minute. The younger son did arise and go to his father. The father ran to him while he was still a long way off, but at least he was facing in the right direction and had given some indication that he was ready to receive the father's love at some level. And in most of the sermons I've heard preached on the prodigal son, that was pretty much the part of the story they focused on. But this older son, this good older brother, has his back turned to his father and is choosing to stay outside. Here, the father doesn't even wait for the older son to say, "I will rise and go to my father." The father goes all the way to him. All angry and defensive though he is, and pleads with him. The father pleads with the son. But he answered his father, "Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. But have you ever thrown a party for me and my friends? Then this son of yours who's thrown away your money on whores shows up, and you go all out with a feast." Isn't that something? While the younger son, off in the pig pen, has believed he wasn't and probably couldn't be loved because of all the bad things he's done, the older son has dutifully, lovelessly followed all the rules, doing everything he was supposed to do, but by his own admission, doing them with the mindset of a slave, just obeying commands, neither giving nor receiving love. He, just like his brother, believes himself unloved and is unloving. Whether near or far, both sons have lived as slaves, sure that the other one was favored. Then the father said to him, "Son, you're always with me. All that is mine is yours." Now, technically, literally, that's probably true. He's got two sons, and one has already received his inheritance. So theoretically, when the father dies, the entire remaining estate would be expected to go to the older brother. So the father says, "All that's mine is yours. You could have barbecued that heifer anytime you wanted. You aren't a slave. You aren't a slave. You're my dear son. All that's mine is yours." But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. First, believe that you are loved by your father. And then celebrate your brother. Rejoice over him. Be loved and love. We have, of course, all at one time or another been the younger son. If you're in church, and you've been in church very often, at some point you've acknowledged that you are the younger son. So crushed by your own pain and your own shame that we think it can never be made right again. We can never really be completely embraced and accepted and trusted again. We can never really hold our heads up again in polite company. I have to confess to you, though, that I've spent most of my life identifying with the older brother. I followed all the rules. I didn't do drugs. I've only been in love with one woman my whole life. I've been in church nearly every Sunday since I was 4 years old. And sometimes I felt invisible. Karen just knows the phrasing I changed there. And sometimes I felt invisible when the younger sons in my life had the dramatic stories to tell and got all the attention. And I always hated this story in the Bible because the only person who looks like a jerk in the story is me. Somehow it's the screw-ups We get the hugs and the kisses and the music and the dancing and the big welcome, and nobody even tells me there's a party. And somehow, I'm the only one who has a problem with that. But the Father calls him dear son and tells him he can freely enjoy everything the Father has, both barbecue beef and the joy in his brother's return. Sometimes I've been the younger son, and the Father has embraced me and loved me and drawn me deeper into the circle of his love and his life. And sometimes I've been the older son, and the Father has embraced me and loved me and drawn me deeper into the circle of his love and his life. And the more I let him do that and allow myself to be loved and to love, the more it begins to dawn on me that besides the two sons, there's one more character in the story that the storyteller calls me to identify with. He invites me to be like the Father. Having learned to receive grace and be a son, like the two brothers, he invites me to go further up and further in and learn to see like he sees. Learn to feel compassion like he feels compassion. Learn to love like he loves. Feel patience like he feels patience. Celebrate like he celebrates. And rejoice like he rejoices. He invites me to experience his joy in his life. And I'm increasingly sure that just allowing myself to be loved as he invites us to do, as surprisingly difficult and enormous a hurdle as that really is, the biggest and hardest hurdle, and the one that brings us the most joy, the most fulfillment, is when I allow myself to start seeing what he sees and loving who he loves like he loves them, to start seeing worth where I didn't see it before. I think that's our destiny, and I think that makes us the church. I love you guys.
We appreciate your ministry here at Capalaba, not just your amazing heartfelt preaching, but most especially your gentle, gracious testimony, both from your lips and in your life, as you have demonstrated to us that God is still God and love is enough. And I take great pleasure at this time, in consultation with our district superintendent, to announce that the Australian Northern Pacific District will be presenting a gift of $5,000 to you for your immediate medical needs and any other needs that you might have at this particular time. And we want you to know that. And sometimes we express love in all kinds of different ways, but from the district, that is an expression of our love. Hopefully you've seen some of these photos up here, people looking a lot younger now than they whatever. Just put on a slideshow, Richard. I think that'll be fine at this time. I'm going to ask, in fact, I'm going to come down, Brad, and meet you halfway. Shireen is our church secretary and our missionary president. He's also been very active in organising this, and I appreciate all that she has done at this time. So we're going to present to you the Distinguished Service Award on behalf of the International Church of the Nazarene, the Capalaba Community Church of the Nazarene, your friends and your family. We love you, and we want to present this to you, suitable for framing. This is a temporary one, the real one's on the way, but this looks about the right thing. So we pay the right money for it. I've got to just read on it, but Brad, we do love you, we do appreciate it very, very, very much. We want to do that, and we want to do this as something for you to reflect upon. Some lovely photos up there of friends that send messages in.